The cold wind moved across the small town of Sitka in a way that always made people pause, as if nature itself carried memories that refused to fade. In the winter of 2005, that wind carried the story of a woman whose disappearance had haunted the community for years. Her name was Sarah Whitford, a 32-year-old librarian known for her quiet humor and steady kindness. People remembered how she would greet every visitor with the same warm expression, no matter how cold the day was. She lived in a modest apartment near the shoreline, a place where she could watch the tides rise and fall with the same rhythm that had shaped her life. She was content with the simplicity of her routines, finding peace in long walks, quiet evenings with books, and gentle conversations with neighbors who appreciated her calm presence. When she vanished in late spring of 2005, the entire community felt as though something essential had been pulled away from them, leaving behind an unsettling silence. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Sarah moved through life as she always had. She spent her mornings helping children pick out storybooks, guiding them with patient enthusiasm. Those who visited the library regularly recalled seeing her smile as she reorganized shelves or helped elderly residents find articles they needed. She had no known conflicts with anyone, no unusual habits, and no history of abrupt decisions. Her life was steady and predictable, which made her sudden absence all the more alarming. The last confirmed sighting of her was outside a small grocery store near Lincoln Street, where she had purchased a few basic items and chatted briefly with a cashier who later recalled nothing unusual in her behavior. She carried the small bag toward her car, and that simple, ordinary moment became the final known piece of her routine before everything changed. When Sarah did not show up for work the next morning, her coworkers grew concerned almost immediately. She had never missed a shift without notifying someone. The library's director, a longtime resident named Frederick Collins, tried calling her several times, only to be met with silence. By afternoon, he drove to her apartment, hoping to find an explanation, a misplaced phone, an unexpected illness, anything that made sense. He knocked on her door, waited, then knocked again, feeling the worry tighten inside him. When there was no response, he contacted local authorities, who conducted a welfare check and quickly realized something was not right. Sarah's car was gone, but her apartment appeared exactly as she would have left it on a normal morning. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs that she had packed anything, and no indication she had planned to leave town. Everything pointed to a sudden disappearance. Sitka police initiated a missing persons investigation, and the community rallied behind the search. Volunteers combed through trails, wooded areas, and roadsides, calling out her name in the chilling air. Boats were sent into nearby waters to scan the shorelines, and search dogs were brought in from Juneau to help track any scent that might lead to her. Despite their efforts, days passed with no clues. Her car, a green sedan she had owned for years, became the focal point of the search until it was discovered parked at a small turnout along a quiet forest road outside town. The location made little sense. It was not a place Sarah would normally visit. Inside the car, groceries she had purchased were still in the back seat, untouched. The presence of those items told investigators she had never made it home after leaving the store. Detectives examined the vehicle meticulously. The car was locked when found, and there were no signs of forced entry. The driver's seat was adjusted in a way consistent with Sarah's height, indicating she had driven it to that location. But the road itself was remote, a place more commonly used by hikers or hunters, not someone like Sarah, who avoided isolated areas unless accompanied by friends. Investigators began questioning everyone who had interacted with her in the days before she vanished. They spoke to her coworkers, neighbors, family members, and acquaintances from around town. No one reported any threats, unusual behavior, or recent conflicts. She had lived a peaceful life, and that very tranquility made her disappearance more bewildering. As the first week passed without progress, concern deepened. For a community as close-knit as Sitka, the uncertainty was overwhelming. Parents held their children a little tighter, friends walked in pairs, and doors were locked earlier than usual. Detectives broadened the search radius and brought in additional support from state authorities. They reviewed security footage from nearby businesses, but Sitka was not heavily covered by cameras at the time, leaving investigators with few visual clues. Posters bearing Sarah's photo appeared everywhere, on storefronts, bulletin boards, and telephone poles, each one a reminder of the unanswered questions that filled the town. Investigators followed every lead, no matter how small, but the trail grew colder with each passing day. A few reports of possible sightings came in from surrounding areas, but none were confirmed. A man claimed to have seen a woman who resembled Sarah walking along a distant trail, but when searched, the area yielded nothing. Another person believed they had seen her car earlier in the day she disappeared, but the timeline could not be verified. The investigation grew increasingly complex as detectives struggled to find any connection or motive that might explain what had happened to her. They reviewed her financial records, phone logs, and library interactions, searching for anything that might have been overlooked, yet everything pointed to her quiet life being abruptly interrupted without warning. Weeks turned into months, and the case shifted from urgent search to lingering mystery. For Sarah's parents, who lived several hours away, the unresolved nature of the disappearance consumed them. They traveled to Sitka regularly, meeting with detectives, organizing searches, and speaking with reporters, hoping that someone, anyone, might come forward with information. Her mother often stood near the shoreline where Sarah liked to walk, staring out at the water as though waiting for her daughter to return. Her father tried to maintain composure during interviews, but the weight of the uncertainty was visible in every word he spoke. The emotional toll on the family was profound, and the growing silence surrounding the case only deepened their despair. As autumn arrived, the search narrowed but did not stop. Investigators continued monitoring leads, rechecking areas they had searched before, and reviewing every detail of the case. They stored evidence carefully, aware that advances in technology might one day provide answers that were currently out of reach. The community, though less visibly active, had not forgotten Sarah. People continued to keep an eye out for anything unusual, and her coworkers maintained a small memorial in the library, with a framed photo and flowers that were replaced regularly. The sense of loss remained strong, woven into the identity of the town. As the first year approached, detectives admitted privately that the investigation had reached a standstill. There were no suspects, no evidence pointing toward foul play, and no indication that Sarah had disappeared by choice. It was as if she had been swallowed by the quiet wilderness surrounding Sitka. Without new information, the case could not move forward, and the weight of that reality rested heavily on everyone involved. Detectives continued to pursue any new detail, but the absence of leads made progress impossible. And yet, despite the quieting activity, there remained a quiet belief among her family and a handful of investigators that one day, something unexpected would break the silence, a detail, a witness, or a memory that had been overlooked. That moment finally arrived, not through technology or sudden discovery, but through a single individual who came forward years later, a person whose conscience refused to stay quiet any longer. The case that had once seemed suspended in timeless uncertainty was about to shift in a way no one had anticipated, setting off a chain of events that would transform the investigation and bring long-hidden truth into the open. The years moved quietly across the small stretch of Anchorage where the memory of Alyssa Merrin, the 27-year-old wildlife center volunteer who vanished one cold evening in 2005, never faded. People talked less about it as time passed, but no one truly forgot. Her friends still kept her photographs in drawers they reopened from time to time, and neighbors still remembered the warmth she carried with her everywhere she went. Her mother kept her room untouched, the small lamp still resting beside the window in the exact place Alyssa used it to read. Even after so many years, the case still carried weight. It wasn't spoken loudly, but its presence always lingered. Detectives assigned to the case in later years tried to review what earlier investigators left behind. They followed every path they could, but nothing moved the case. Every person interviewed in the early years had already been talked to at least once. Every piece of evidence had been studied many times. Her last known steps never changed in the reports. She left the wildlife center after a long volunteer shift, walked toward her car, and then all signs of her simply stopped. For nearly 2 decades, that was the only truth investigators had. But time has its own way of bringing things forward. And in 2024, when the case was reopened as part of a statewide review of unsolved disappearances, something finally shifted. A name showed up in the old list of people interviewed. At the time, he had been a young man working seasonal jobs near the wildlife center. He was 23 in 2005. The old notes described him as cooperative, calm, and helpful. But that was all. Nothing in the file suggested he knew anything important. He wasn't connected to Alyssa in any meaningful way, at least not in the documents. When detectives reached out to him again, now living in a small coastal town several miles from Anchorage, he didn't respond at first. The call went to voicemail. A second call was made, and this time someone answered. His voice was careful, as though he instantly recognized who was calling and why. He agreed to meet them but asked for the meeting to be somewhere quiet. They met at a small cafe near the harbor. He arrived early and sat near the window away from everyone. The detectives noticed right away that he kept his hands tightly clasped, as if steadying himself. He spoke slowly, and his eyes glanced downward each time he prepared himself to say something more. He told them he had never forgotten Alyssa. She used to greet him each morning when he passed the wildlife center on his way to his shift. She didn't know him personally, but she always waved. That wave stayed with him for years, the kindness in it, the ease, the sincerity. He described it as something rare. And then, after a long breath, he told them he saw something the night she disappeared, something he had kept inside for almost 20 years. He said he had been walking toward the parking lot after leaving his own shift when he noticed a man standing near Alyssa's car. It was dark, the only light coming from a weak overhead lamp. He saw Alyssa approaching the car and noticed the man move closer. There was something about the way he stepped, slow, purposeful, that pulled the witness's attention. But he didn't think anything was wrong until he saw the man speak to her. Alyssa stepped back. The witness froze. He didn't understand what he was seeing, so he convinced himself it was a misunderstanding and walked away before anything else happened. For years, he tried to forget this moment, telling himself it probably meant nothing. But the way Alyssa stepped back never left his mind. When the detectives asked him why he stayed silent for so long, he said he feared he misread everything. He feared bringing up something that might not be real, and he feared the weight of getting involved. But now he was older. He said he didn't want to leave the memory unspoken anymore. Detectives asked him if he recognized the man he saw that night. The witness nodded slowly. He described someone around his own age in 2005, someone who worked in a nearby facility. A name came forward, a man who had already been in the case file, interviewed once long ago, but not considered significant. The detectives left the cafe with a completely different understanding of the case. The witness's statement didn't just add a new layer, it shifted the entire timeline. It gave detectives a moment that had never been acknowledged before, and it placed someone near Alyssa at a time no one previously confirmed. They pulled the old files again. This man, Nathan Carr, now in his early 40s, had been interviewed briefly at the time. He said he didn't know Alyssa. He said he left work early that day. But the new witness claimed he saw him near her car. That was something investigators had never had before. Someone directly placing Nathan in the same place as Alyssa at the same moment. Detectives requested archival employment logs from the small facility where Nathan used to work. Many records had been digitized over time. When they reviewed the 2005 attendance documents, they noticed a small detail that had been missed originally. Nathan's exit time that day did not match what he had told investigators back then. It showed he left the facility later than he claimed, and that time put him in the parking lot exactly when Alyssa would have been walking to her car. This discovery wasn't enough on its own, but it was the first structural piece in a case that had been empty for years. The witness statement supported the old record. The old record supported the witness statement. The two elements reinforced each other with unusual clarity. Detectives then searched for any preserved evidence from the 2005 scene. The original investigation had taken swabs from Alyssa's car door handle and trunk latch, even though no strong leads came from them back then. Those samples were moved into long-term storage, and now, with improvements in laboratory technology, they could be examined again. The lab agreed to test the samples with advanced methods that could detect extremely faint DNA. It took several weeks before the results came back. Everyone involved felt the anticipation quietly building, as though the case itself was breathing again for the first time in years. When the results were returned, the lab report included something no one expected: a partial DNA profile on the trunk latch that was Alyssa's. It was faint but clear enough to cross-check. The lab ran it through state and national databases. No immediate match appeared, but the sample had enough identifiable markers to narrow down potential connections. The detectives paused when they saw one detail in the report. The DNA profile shared a common pattern with several individuals from a particular regional cluster. That meant one thing: they needed to look deeper into genealogy-based analysis. Not full genetic genealogy like in other nationwide cases, but a smaller-scale comparative analysis that could identify similar lineages. When the lab completed this analysis, the report came back with something the detectives felt the weight of instantly. The DNA belonged to someone closely connected to the family line of Nathan Carr. The new witness, the old log discrepancy, and now this genetic link, everything converged. Nathan was quietly placed under surveillance. Detectives reviewed his past, his movements, his employment history, and any possible connections to Alyssa. They discovered he had left Anchorage a year after her disappearance and moved between small towns for decades. He lived a quiet life, worked simple jobs, and stayed under the radar. Detectives requested a discreet collection of a fresh DNA sample. They waited outside a grocery store near his home, gathered what they needed legally and without contact, and sent it directly to the lab. Days later, the call came in. The fresh DNA was a direct match to the profile found on Alyssa's trunk. The investigation shifted instantly into the next stage. Everything that had been silent for 20 years suddenly aligned. But investigators moved carefully, determined to ensure every detail was accurate and every piece of the case was supported. They began preparing for the moment that would finally bring answers to Alyssa's family after nearly 2 decades of hope held quietly inside them. The news moved through the Anchorage Police Department quietly at first, almost like a breath held between rooms. Detectives who had been part of the review process gathered slowly in the conference area, each knowing the significance of the DNA confirmation they had just received. Nearly 20 years had passed since Alyssa Merrin disappeared after leaving her volunteer shift at the Wildlife Center, and for the first time the case carried a piece of evidence that opened a clear path forward. No one spoke loudly. The weight of the moment didn't allow it. It was the kind of silence that felt full of years of waiting, full of hopes preserved by her family, full of the countless hours investigators had given since 2005. Detective Maren Holt, who had taken the lead when the cold case review began again, studied the report with a stillness that came only from deep focus. She knew what the match meant. The partial DNA profile collected from the trunk latch all those years ago was now linked directly to Nathan Carr, a man who had lived quietly for nearly 2 decades. The science was clear. The timeline was clear. The witness testimony aligned perfectly with both. Yet she moved carefully, understanding how important it was to build every step solidly. Cold cases demanded patience, even when answers seemed finally within reach. The detectives reviewed every piece of the case again. They reconstructed Alyssa's last known movements, comparing the 2005 interviews to the new ones. They studied Nathan's work schedule from that day, matching it to the updated timeline provided by the witness. Every detail pointed in one direction. Nathan had been near Alyssa's car when she arrived. No one else was placed there at that moment. The witness described the step, the movement, the proximity between them. It was the missing scene that had always been absent, the moment that connected the earlier hours to the unexplained disappearance. Once detectives completed their final review, they prepared to make contact. The decision was not rushed. They informed the district attorney's office, presented their findings in a detailed packet, and allowed prosecutors to examine the results with equal thoroughness. When the prosecutors gave their approval, the team planned the approach. Nathan had been living in a modest neighborhood near Seward, in a small rental home tucked between tall spruce trees. He worked at a marine supply shop, kept to himself, and rarely traveled far from the area. Detectives coordinated with local law enforcement, outlining the best time and place to approach him safely and respectfully. They wanted calm. They wanted clarity. They wanted a conversation rooted in truth, not pressure. On a cool morning just after sunrise, the detectives traveled to Seward. The air was crisp, and golden light reflected off the water as they arrived near Nathan's home. The neighborhood was quiet. A fishing boat could be heard starting up in the distance, its soft hum echoing through the narrow streets. The scene looked peaceful, almost deceptively so, considering the decades-long story they were about to step into. When Nathan opened the door, he appeared surprised but not alarmed. He recognized Detective Holt from their earlier interview, and for a moment she noticed something shift in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, that time had finally caught up. She explained why they were there and asked if he would come with them to the station to answer some questions. He agreed without hesitation. His calmness wasn't defiance. It felt more like acceptance, as though he already knew the day would eventually come. At the Seward station, detectives spoke with Nathan in a quiet interview room. He sat with his hands folded before him, mirroring the posture of the witness who had come forward weeks earlier. When the detectives asked about Alyssa, he paused, then spoke slowly. He said he remembered her. He said she had always been friendly, always kind. And then he said something else. He wished things had been different that night. Detectives asked him to explain what he meant. Nathan took a long breath and then described how he had seen Alyssa walking toward her car on that cold evening in 2005. He said he approached her to speak with her, hopping to offer assistance because her car door looked slightly open, something he thought might be accidental. He said the moment felt ordinary at first, nothing out of place. But he also said that the more he tried to explain why he stepped closer, the more it all blurred in his memory. Detectives didn't push him, but they asked clear questions. They asked why his DNA had been found on her trunk. They asked why his earlier interview in 2005 didn't align with the new witness statement. And they asked why he never mentioned seeing her in the parking lot that night. Nathan lowered his head. His voice softened. He said he had been afraid to speak up back then. He said he didn't know what the right words were, and by the time he considered coming forward, the moment had passed. But as he continued, detectives sensed something deeper. He wasn't simply recalling a moment. He was carrying the memory of its weight. He didn't deny being near her car. He didn't deny touching it. He didn't deny approaching her. He said he tried to speak with her but sensed she was startled. He said he stepped back and then left the area quickly, not wanting to trouble her. When asked why he never explained this earlier, he said he convinced himself that if investigators needed him, they would return. When they didn't, he kept quiet. Detectives listened carefully. Every sentence mattered. They compared his words to the timeline they had created. And as they continued the interview, Nathan's statements placed him in the center of the moment that had been missing for 20 years. When detectives ended the conversation, they stepped out to review everything. His admission aligned with the DNA. It aligned with the witness's account. It aligned with the evidence. When they returned, They informed Nathan he would be taken into custody based on the results of the investigation. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements. He nodded slowly, as though he had expected this moment long before it arrived. Back in Anchorage, news of the arrest traveled through the community with a quiet strength. People who remembered Alyssa spoke about her again, this time with a sense of release. Her mother was contacted gently by detectives assigned to family outreach. When they told her the news, she closed her eyes and let the moment settle. She had lived nearly 2 decades waiting for an answer she wasn't certain would ever come. Hearing that the case had moved forward didn't remove the years, but it offered her something she hadn't felt in a very long time: relief. As the case prepared to move through the courts, detectives focused on presenting every detail carefully. They reconstructed the timeline, documented the witness testimony, recorded the DNA findings, and ensured all earlier investigative steps were clearly connected. They understood the importance of presenting the case with precision and clarity. During this time, the witness who had stepped forward returned to Anchorage to provide a formal statement. He spoke calmly, grateful that the moment he carried inside had finally found a place in the story. Detectives thanked him for his courage, knowing the case may have remained still forever without his voice. Public interest grew steadily as the story became known. Local news outlets covered the development, focusing on Alyssa's kindness, her volunteer work, her warmth with wildlife center visitors, and the way she had touched her community. Among these reports, people spoke of the hope that kept them connected to her memory. Friends who had grown older since her disappearance said they felt something lift, not an end to the past, but a gentle opening toward peace. The district attorney's office prepared the final charges once all evidence had been fully reviewed. The case moved forward with confidence, supported by the science, the statements, and the timeline. It didn't feel rushed. It felt steady, deliberate, and deserved. In the months that followed, people visited the wildlife center where Alyssa spent so much of her time. Staff placed a small plaque near the entry, honoring her dedication and the joy she brought to the animals she cared for. Visitors paused there often, reading her name, reflecting on her life, and appreciating the care she had given to the place. Detective Holt visited the same spot quietly one afternoon. She stood still for a moment, watching the soft movement of the trees and listening to the quiet hum of the center around her. She thought about the years that had passed since Alyssa's disappearance, about the countless detectives who had carried the case before her, and about the single witness who finally gave voice to the missing piece. She thought about how long truth can rest before it finally rises. And she thought about Alyssa, a young woman whose kindness lingered even after decades, a woman whose story waited patiently for someone to step forward, a woman whose memory stayed strong enough to pull an entire investigation back toward the light. When the case finally reached its conclusion, it did so with clarity, with care, and with the knowledge that Alyssa's family now had answers they had waited since 2005 to receive. It did not erase the years, but it honored them. It honored her.